Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And welcome to the, I believe it's second annual Laredo UFO Conference. Again, my name is Dr. Bob Gross, and before we start, I'd like to remind everyone, myself included, please turn off our cell phones during the presentations today. Done. And again, I would like to thank this group, the Laredo Paranormal Research Society, and Mr. Ismail Lear for setting up this organization, and also Mr. Noe Torres for asking me to appear at this event this morning. It should be quite an exciting event, and let's get rolling. My presentation, my lecture this morning is going to be on the Kecksburg incident. I will be giving a PowerPoint lecture, and then after the PowerPoint lecture on the Kecksburg incident, which is known as the 7th most important incident in UFO history, and I will go to as much detail as possible that an hour would let me do with you. And then after that, there will be a window, a follow-up session on question and answers relating to the lecture. I'm originally from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I am not from the Texas area, even though I consider Chicago, Illinois to be my hometown right now. I was born and raised, for the most part, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania is known as one of the leading states for UFO traffic. And if you can read those charts, there are two charts there. One is from MUFON, and the other is from the National UFO Reporting Center. And they list Pennsylvania as the ranked the fourth hottest spot for UFOs in the United States, and on the NUFORC chart, it's listed as 8th. Now, if you also can read those charts, you can see that Texas is ranked way up there as well. In Pennsylvania, there's a county in Pennsylvania that's one of the top 100 UFO hotspots based on recordings of UFO sightings. And that's a county known as Westmoreland, Pennsylvania. Westmoreland County in Pennsylvania, and that's where Kecksburg is located. One of the reasons there are so many reportings from Westmoreland County is the fact that there's an organization there, or there was an organization there, known as the Pennsylvania Association for the Study of the Unexplained, or as it's referred to as PASSOW or PASSU. PASSOW was established in 1981 by a man by the name of Stanley Gordon. This group, it was a group of individuals, approximately 35 members, that were committed to the scientific study of paranormal phenomena. And they were actually studying it. They created a legitimate correlational longitudinal study. It was a research study to see if there were any links between paranormal phenomenon and natural phenomena. So there was actually a research study going on with PASSOW. This is Stanley Gordon. Stanley was the director of PASSOW. And there you can see he's in his command center in Greensburg, Pennsylvania. And there was all types of equipment there. Anything from Geiger counters to tape recorders to oscilloscopes. And if you were a member of PASSOW, and especially a field representative, you were trained on how to effectively and efficiently use the equipment that was in Stanley's command center in his home in Greensburg, Pennsylvania. PASSOW, in my opinion, at that time at least, was the Cadillac of paranormal investigation units. Most, if not all, of the members of PASSOW were professionals. They were professional volunteers, anywhere from doctors, medical doctors, plastic surgeons, dentists, There were law enforcement agents there. There were directors. I was a researcher with them. There were public officials. There were all types of people, and also we had access to labs like Westinghouse, Alcoa, GE, and other labs in the Pittsburgh area that would do lab work for PASA. It was a very top-notch group. Here you can see what this is. It's a copy of a letter that went out from PASA yearly, and it listed, if you were a member of PASA, that there was a meeting every month, and it also discussed that the members of that organization would be dealing with sensitive materials. Also, here's another statement with the actually PR information talking about PASA, and I blew it up a little bit here, but it states here that the individuals in the PASA organization are all volunteers, scientists, engineers, and so forth, and they also have access to consultants as needed for special projects. PASA's main investigation area were UFOs, but they also investigated other paranormal activities such as Bigfoot, hauntings, and other credible unexplained phenomena. I personally didn't get involved with PASA until 1985. As I said earlier, the Kecksburg incident happened in 1965, so 20 years later. I contacted PASA in 1985, not because I was some UFO fanatic, but because basically my background is in the fine arts. In 1980, I had written a children's musical. And the musical was based on goblins. And the musical won a second place prize in the nation that was given by the, I believe it's the Open Court Publishing Company. And I wanted to write another musical, and I knew that flying saucers fascinated children. So I contacted PASA because I had heard about them on the KDKA radio back in Pittsburgh at that time, where they did their own shows. So I contacted PASA. I asked, may I have access to your files so I can write this new musical and base it on real reports and incidents that happened in Pennsylvania as a more credibility to the children's musical that I was writing. And they gave me a yes, but it was more or less under certain conditions. I had received a doctorate from Penn State back in 1984, just a year before. And I was the first doctoral student at Penn State to use a statistical tool known as a MANOVA, or multivariate analysis of variance. And as a result, I was traveling around the country at that time doing presentations on my research on behalf of Penn State. Penn State is a top-notch research facility. And regardless of what Joe Paterno might have done, it is still a top-notch university. And when you're doing research, especially at a place like Penn State, and when you're working in the realm of ufology, your research has got to be airtight. You've got to find primary sources, which essentially are reports or interviews from witnesses of certain events, instead of secondary sources. Secondary sources are articles about the incidents. You have to use and be capable of using what are called higher order thinking skills, which means you have to analyze, evaluate, and synthesize the information you're working with. That's very important to do that. Use those higher order thinking skills in the research field and actually in most fields. That's where most people get that edge. You will also, it helps to be creative. You've got to put things together at a very high level and have creative insight, because your presentations of your research have got to be accurate and they've got to be precisely reported. You really can't fudge too much or you're going to be called on it. So you really have to have your act together as far as a researcher goes, especially in the field of the paranormal research. So the conditions that Stanley Gordon gave me with PASA stated that I could have access to their files if I would function as a professional researcher field investigator for PASA, I had to submit to a background check. Remember, I was a musician. And I had to undergo a psychological test. All three of those conditions had to be met before I could become a member of PASA. This was 1985. That is my badge for PASA. You can see there's quite a similar resemblance. I know it's a little dark there, but that was a 1985 badge to receive. So obviously I passed all three of those criteria and was able to become a member of the group. Well, when you become a member of the group, you also receive a field investigator's manual. And as you can see here, this is one page from the manual. I brought one with me, and they're about 3/4 of an inch thick. And this is one page from a chart from the manual, and this is a PASA UFO shape ID chart. As you can see, there are several different shapes here. And each one of those shapes has a label to it, a number. So these are all different shapes. Here's one that looks like a Mickey Mouse hat. But these are all shapes that have been identified as types of UFOs. And this was only one page. And each shape has a label or a number that labels it. And this came from the PASA's field investigator chart. Now here's a similar chart that came from the U.S. Air Force. You'll notice all of these shapes are different shapes of aircraft, but they're all labeled as weather balloons. Except for the weather balloon, which is labeled as swamp gas. Now, obviously, that's not a real U.S. Air Force ID chart, but I just thought I'd show you, and this is kind of like proof of what type of things that have been going on over the years. Just to give you a very, very brief timeline of my background with the paranormal, actually, after I joined PASA in '85, I sort of forgot about the musical because there were so many interesting things going on in Pennsylvania at that time. And again, this was kind of a hotbed of paranormal activity. But in 1985, I conducted my first field investigation for PASA. In '87, I participated in a unique event that was participated in what was known as the National UFO Information Week, where we gathered information from the public, started gathering information from the public just on UFO sightings, and there were phenomenal results. In '89, I had my own close encounter of the first kind, which means it's more than 500 feet, and I suggest everyone experience one of those at least in your lifetime, and I had a rather intimate encounter that was about 8 inches away, so that's another story for another time. But I investigated that and then researched the type of object that I witnessed at that time. In 2006 then, and there were other events in between, but in 2006 I joined a group known as the Albuquerque Paranormal Group, and in 2010 I joined the Las Cruces Paranormal Investigators. In 2011 then I finally joined MUFON. I had not joined MUFON to that point, but in 2011 I had joined MUFON. Now, the Kecksburg incident. The information that I'll be giving you, a lot of it is based on witnesses that I interviewed as a member of PASA. And anytime that you'll see an asterisk beside a statement, that means that that asterisk was a primary resource, basically because I had interviewed an individual to get that information. So those were primary sources. So some of this is not necessarily freely open to the public. The Kecksburg incident, it started on a Thursday, back in December 9th, 1965. It started taking place in Canada. And it ended in a rural area outside of Pittsburgh, known as Kecksburg. Now, Kecksburg is located about 53 miles from a little burb of Pittsburgh known as Natrona Heights, Pennsylvania. That's where I was growing up and living at the time. And I heard the entire Kecksburg incident unfold sitting in a 1965 Chevy Impala in a church parking lot, listening to an AM radio broadcast of the KDK radio station on the Kecksburg incident because they were watching it come in. The radio broadcasters were broadcasting about it, and KDK TV was also putting out a television program based on what was going on in Kecksburg. So I should have been inside the church listening, but I was actually inside my car listening. Kecksburg was about 53 miles at that time from where I was listening to the event unfold on the radio. I was only a senior in high school. My parents wouldn't let me take the car to Kecksburg. I don't know if they didn't want me to get abducted or they just didn't trust me driving that far. But I couldn't go out to the event that was happening at that time. But from northern Canada, the whole way up through western Pennsylvania, there were thousands of witnesses that described this object, not just a few, there were thousands. Some of those witnesses were pilots, were also pilots. They described it as a very bright fireball, and this fireball had a trail of smoke behind it. And everyone reported the same object. But then, it could have been a meteor, except when it was over Ohio, the state of Ohio, again, it was coming from Canada, it did something strange. It slowed down, it stopped, and it turned, it made a left, it started heading towards Pennsylvania. There are witnesses to this. Taking a little further, this is actually a photograph, you can see it moving here. This was a photograph that was taken somewhere in Michigan, I think it was around Detroit, of the object coming in. So that's an actual slide of a photograph of that object. Later, right now, remember it's over, it's heading towards Pennsylvania. A little later, a man by the name of, we'll call him for the sake of keeping his name, even though he's deceased, but Paul Kay was a student at St. Vincent's College in Latrobe. He was on the campus of St. Vincent's College in Latrobe, which is about 13 miles from Kecksburg. He looked up, Paul looked up, he saw the object, he saw it slow down again and make another turn. This turn, it made a right turn and started heading towards Greensburg, Pennsylvania. Not your typical meteor. Any of you have followed meteors that usually don't behave that way. Now, the UFO, it was moving slowly, very slowly actually, towards Greensburg. And it made yet another turn around Greensburg and started heading north towards Kecksburg. It was actually, it was controlled. As far as anyone that witnessed this coming in, they described this as a controlled entry or re-entry, depending on where you think it came from. When it finally landed, and there were witnesses that saw it right after it landed, there was only slight damage to it. There was like this, maybe just one minor dent to the object itself. And there was a shallow path cut into the earth where it landed. And there were a couple of trees allegedly knocked over, but not a lot of damage. So this UFO came in very carefully, unlike a meteor and unlike any space debris or satellite that anyone was aware of in 1965. They weren't aware of having those kind of capacities with a space vehicle. This is the path that it took. Now, most presenters show you the black line. So you can see there were witnesses in Canada, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, New York, and of course Pennsylvania. So that makes up for like 7 states plus Canada. And here, and I added this, I should have gone into art, I guess, instead of music. But I added this red path. As you can see, once it was over Ohio, it made a turn, headed towards Pennsylvania. Once it got to Pennsylvania, it was over Latrobe, it headed towards, it made another turn towards Greensburg. Over Greensburg, it heads a little bit north, makes another turn, and heads towards Kecksburg. So here's how things start to unfold in Kecksburg. At around 4:47 p.m., there's a witness, and her name actually was Mrs. Jones, and she called the local radio station in Greensburg and reported to a reporter there, his name is John Murphy, that she said a huge fireball crashed in the woods about 1.5 miles from where she was calling from. So Murphy realized this could be a story. He was already hearing that there was talk about this vehicle or ship coming in, object coming in. He drove to this site. He drove to Kecksburg, and he found activity going on there already. He found police cars. I mean, there was a fire truck there already by the time he got to the site, which wasn't too far from where the radio station was. The fire truck was from a local fire department there in Kecksburg. Now, as soon as he gets there, in essence, all hell breaks loose. The military shows up, the state police show up, and they rope off the area. Armed guards are placed on each road so no one can get through. Now, please keep in mind, okay, Pennsylvania, in that wooded area, it's pretty far back there. So there's people out, with spotlights looking for deer and whatever. They're out there doing things already. So there's already witnesses at the crash site. Nobody knows that, but they're down there. So there's people down there already. The armed guards get placed at the roads to stop people from coming in. The Air Force occupies the local fire station where the fire truck came from, takes it over. They take all the firemen and tell them you have to wait outside. So all the firemen are waiting outside, and they're watching the military bring in all types of major equipment, including large communication gear. Then these large transport trucks show up, at least 2 of them, and one of them has an Army insignia on the side. And then one is a flatbed truck, a large flatbed truck. They show up. We're talking here just minutes after the reported sighting. At first they called it a meteor, they called it a plane that crashed, just about anything you'd like to call it, a satellite coming in from Russia. But everyone got there pretty quickly. They bring in these trucks, and they notice that the trucks, once they're there, they drive into the forest where the object landed. And there's people living in Laredo, which is, again, just a few miles away, 13 miles away. They start seeing planes land at the local airport that hadn't been used for years. So this place is coming alive in just a few minutes after the landing. So virtually, the military put the entire town under martial law. One witness, now we'll call him Bill B. Bill heard on the radio, KDKA radio, the event taking place, so he goes out there. He had nothing better to do that day. It was a Thursday night in December. As I can recall, it was a pretty warm December too. There wasn't really any snow on the ground in Pennsylvania. And he happens to see the object. He gets close enough to see. He's one of the few that get there before they chase them away. Because at one point, once the military got there, the police got there, they chased anyone away. And when the reporter asked one of the policemen who had just come back from viewing the object, when the reporter asked him what he saw, he said, talk to my attorney. They would not give information out about what was down there. So Bill B happened to see this, and he said it looked kind of like a bullet. It was sticking out of the ground. There was a shallow trench that had formed upon landing. Bill also stated it looked like a big burnt orange. It was about 9 feet wide and 12 feet long. That's a pretty big orange. Years later, excuse me. Years later, another witness came forward. He was one of the original firemen that was sent to the site thinking it was a plane crash. His name is James Romansky. He came out publicly a few years later. He was 19 years old at the time, and he was a member of that firefighting team that they were sent there because they thought, again, plane had crashed early on. Now, what James claimed was that he saw the object as well when he went down there. He claims it's shaped more like an acorn than a bullet. And it was made of a shiny silvery metal, which had a light touch of gold in the color. Its bottom, the base of the object, the base of the acorn, had a bumper around it. And the ring, that bumper, had some odd, strange writing or symbols on it that he claimed looked like hieroglyphics, but without the animals. Now, James was of Russian descent, and he had seen some Russian writing, and he said it didn't look like anything like any Russian writing that he had ever seen before. So he ruled out Russian, and he ruled out hieroglyphics because of the lack of animals. To your right, you see a drawing that was made based on James Romansky's description of what he saw landing there. And you can see here, this is the type of writing. You know, he was taking a rough guess of what those symbols look like on this bumper or band here. And also here is a newspaper article from the day that the object landed in Kecksburg back in 1965. Now, just a sidebar that you might find interesting. Back in 1977, the United States launched a couple of Voyager space probes. Now, those space probes had on the sides, they had objects that looked like this. Yes. This was a cover for a disc that was attached to each one of those space probes. As you can see, there are symbols on this cover. And it was, remember the old 33 RPM LP records? This was a cover to one of those records that were attached to the Voyager space probes. And inside the cover was a recording of Sounds of Earth. And I had a colleague of mine, his name is Paul Winter, back in Pennsylvania, and he had the music that was on the recordings of Sounds of Earth. So in my opinion, what those symbols could have been on the bumper would have been symbols, and what these do is they describe where this object came from and how to play the recording. And in my opinion, the symbols on the bumper could have been those type of symbols, describing what the vehicle was and how it was to be used and where it came from. That's just my personal research and opinion. But these were launched in 1977. So back to the Kecksburg incident now. Later that night, a convoy of trucks, that convoy of trucks I talked about earlier, left the wooded area. And there were witnesses, eyewitnesses, that saw the flatbed truck carrying an object on it that was covered with a tarp, like one of those blue tarps you see on roofs that are being repaired and so forth. And the tarp was tightly pulled around the object. And you could tell by looking at the object that it was an acorn shape and about the size of the Volkswagen Beetle. Now, the next day, the same object was seen again. Now, it wasn't flying. It was still on the back of the flatbed truck. And it was seen in Lockbourne Air Force Base in Columbus, Ohio. That was on the 10th. Excuse me. On the 11th, it was seen again. And this time it was at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. So if any of you that follow UFOs, you know that's kind of a famous area. Now, over the years, now remember this happened in 1965. Kecksburg incident, individuals kept coming forward as they felt safe and started providing more and more details of the event. And actually, even up through, that I'm aware of, 2011, there are still people calling in with information related to the Kecksburg incident. Now, one of the later witnesses included this event. He claims that 2 days after the incident occurred at Kecksburg, so that would be on the 11th of December, a witness from a brick factory This brick factory that was in Dayton, Ohio, claimed to have received an order for specially glazed bricks. A representative from Wright-Patterson went to the brick factory, checked out the bricks they had there, and he said, yep, those will do, I'll take 6,500 of them. And he told, this representative from Wright-Patterson told individuals at the brick factory that the reason they were buying these bricks for Wright-Patterson was they were building a double-walled shield around a recovered radioactive object. Later on, the truck driver from that brick factory in Dayton delivers the bricks to Wright-Patterson. And he decides to take a peek inside the hangar where the bricks are supposed to be delivered to. And what he sees inside of a type of mosquito net screen type of a parachute object that had slits in it, he sees a bell-shaped object. Whitish bronze, he claims it's whitish bronze. It's about 9 feet tall, or 9 feet wide and 12 feet tall. Another corroboration of a witness seeing the same type of object. And this gets people to thinking. So here's kind of a related sidebar, some other research that I was doing. Many of the Kecksburg witnesses, what they described was what was once known as Kammler's Bell. Kammler's Bell was a super secret weapon of the Nazis that was developed back in the 1940s. Unfortunately, Kammler and the bell disappeared around 1945. And no one is exactly sure what happened to either of them. There's still some discussion. The jury is still out on that situation. Now, the common features between the incident, the UFO, at Kecksburg and the Kammler's Bell are, the bell was also a metallic object about 9 feet tall in diameter and 12 to 15 feet wide. The bell looked like a bell, but it was really radioactive. And when they were experimenting with it, there were a lot of deaths involved, of plants and animals as well. The bell was linked to both anti-gravity experiments in Germany as well as time travel experiments. And again, I'm just giving you some bullet points related to this. And the chamber where the bell was tested had these same type of ceramic bricks and rubber mats that were ordered at the Dayton, Ohio brick factory. And remember, how did they know to order these kind of bricks just a day or two after this object lands? Something was going on. Now this is a picture, if you can see it, this is kind of rough to see sometimes, but this is a model, it's not the bell itself. This is a model of Kammler's Bell, what it looked like. Here is a model, again this is a model, of the UFO that landed in Kecksburg. You can see here, there is the bumper. Here are two comparative drawings. The bell, the Kecksburg UFO. Very, very similar. Now, very quick summary of this whole event that happened at Kecksburg back in 1965. And again, any time where you see an asterisk, that means that's information that I received through first-hand interviews with witnesses. The most likely possibilities declared at that time is that the Kecksburg UFO was a highly advanced man-made probe, space probe, with unconventional re-entry control capabilities, because there was no means of slowing down an object like that in 1965 that anybody on Earth at least would claim fame for. And then it could have also been the second most likely possibility was a re-entry, an extraterrestrial spacecraft, or in my opinion, perhaps an extraterrestrial space probe. So those are the two top possibilities that were discussed. There were approximately 21 eyewitnesses to the event, it coming in from the landing in Kecksburg. Members of the Army, Air Force, and NASA began to arrive almost immediately in the area, which is a little odd. They must have been watching it the whole time, is what most people's opinion is. Other additional information. There were many people that got down to the crash site, or the landing site, right after it happened, before the police got there. And I spoke with witnesses where they claimed that at first some people claimed there was blue smoke that rose up, and actually what that was steam coming from the object passing through a shallow stream or creek, or crick as they called it in Pennsylvania at that time. The object, because it was hot and highly radioactive, caused steam that dissipated very quickly. Hundreds of spectators were at Kecksburg. Even though they had roped it off, there were still hundreds of spectators there watching at the crash site. Some of the witnesses did get near the crash and took pictures of it with flash cameras. And those flash cameras and some of the descriptions were described as lightning or other events. Many trees, even though there were a couple of trees knocked over, the military replaced several other trees in the area. In my opinion, because they didn't want it to be traced in the rings years later on the effect of radioactivity on any tree that it passed on its landing path. Also, the Cosmos 96 was ruled out as being the object in 2003. The official summary was, and there was a headline in the Greensburg local newspaper. It just stated, unidentified flying object falls near Kecksburg, and the Army ropes off the area. They couldn't deny that. There were too many witnesses. The official military report stated no object was found in the woods. The official military report also was the dazzling object that everyone saw in the sky that made the turns and had the smoke trail was a meteor. A report that the event was involving the recovery of a Soviet satellite during the Cold War at that time. That rumor was dismantled back in 2011. More. In August 15th, 1987, and also what happened in August of 1988, PASA set up displays at the Westmoreland Mall, Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. PASA, the Pennsylvania Association for the Study of the Unexplained, they exhibited redacted documents that were classified documents. Some were gotten because of the Freedom of Information Act, and artifacts that were recovered at landings of UFOs. This display had workshops, it involved interviews, and data and information were released. Excuse me. I was one of the interviewers at that session. I think this was the first formal session. And we expected somewhere around, we thought 50 people would show up. So there were about 10 of us who were field investigators. And that day, 700 people showed up with information regarding just UFO incidents in that Pennsylvania area. And that day I met Linda Moulton Howe, and some of you may have heard of her. She has her own Earth Links, I believe it's called, earthfiles.com, and she's on the Coast to Coast radio station. Her mother was there describing an incident she had experienced, and what also Linda's work, and also George Knapp was there for this UFO information gathering session. Here is a flyer that came out that PASA put out regarding the first displays that happened back in 1987. Now, there's something strange here. Those displays that started in 1987, I refer to those as PASA kicking the hornet's nest. Because around 1996, researchers found out that NASA, who was at the site in 1965 of the Kecksburg incident, had sent 2 boxes worth of information to a place known as excuse me, the the Washington National Record Center. So essentially NASA sent 2 boxes of information to this National Record Center for Safekeeping around 1965, around the time that the event occurred. In 1996, when researchers found that these boxes of information had been sent to the center, the research center in Washington, they tried to recoup those boxes. So a representative from NASA sent the Washington National Record Center a letter asking for those boxes. The center wrote back saying they disappeared in 1987. So they're in those boxes, they were known as francology files, which consist of reports on objects, trying to determine the national ownership, tests run on any kind of the elements found on the objects that they've recovered, as well as classified information. And only a NASA official could have requested those file boxes back. Now, a type of an epilogue to this whole event. Again, working as a field investigator for PASA, and we met once a month for, I think, 11 months a year. Attempts to get information from the Freedom of Information Act were mostly ineffective. And shortly after those Westmoreland Mall display sessions in 1987, Director of PASA, Stanley Gordon, received a notice to testify in front of a panel in Washington, D.C. As a result, since all of us involved in PASA were essentially professionals, we essentially went underground. And where we used to sign in and pay dues at every meeting, we didn't sign in anymore. And the meetings, we didn't pay dues, we paid in stamps because they didn't want to trace the money. And the meetings were much more with spaces in between them. They were on a need-to-know basis. That's about it. Questions?
Was there any evidence, or did anybody check to see if there's any mercury or anything like that in the area where the vehicle crashed? And maybe a stronger connection than that?
Again, the question was, did anyone ever check to see if there was any mercury in the area? To my knowledge, there were some analysis of the ground in that area, but years later. There was no one, once the military roped off that area, no one had access to it. Then the military came in, replanted trees, and did, redid the ground so that anything that was there was gone. Yes, sir.
That camera, so you said the flash cameras that took pictures. Where took pictures?
Regarding the flash cameras that took the pictures, some are in, let's say, some of the pictures are in custody of the director. There are some that are still out there that they're waiting to bring forward at a safer time. And there were, I spoke directly to a witness that said, a lot of the reports are saying there was lightning and flashes coming from the object when it landed. And he said that wasn't the case. He said we were on the other side in the woods using flash cubes, because this was 1965, with our cameras taking photographs of it. And they actually claimed that they still had those photographs. My understanding is there's still some out there. They're waiting to come forward because some of the pictures that were taken were taken. Yes, sir.
In your comments, you sort of alluded to your thoughts as being extraterrestrial when you were going through the points there, instead of a man-made or earth-made object. That's the way I come across. I lean towards that at times, yes. If we're looking at the logistics of what happened, the lady that called in around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, is that when the incident had happened, 4 o'clock or 3 o'clock? Or? You mean when it landed? Yes. When she called it around 4:47, she saw it going into the woods. And then right after she saw that, there were other witnesses that claimed that that's when they saw the smoke coming up, and other witnesses still claimed that there were, and again, I'm talking like lots of witnesses, so I'm kind of narrowing this down, that there was a
a bright lighted object that appeared above the trees right after it went down. So there was some discrepancy, but at around 4:47, there still would have been some daylight there, excuse me, even at Eastern time in December. But they did see it come down, and it was slow enough that it didn't cause much damage to the area or to the object.
Yeah, and I've been in the military for 40 years. We're not efficient enough to get a flatbed truck out there shortly after an incident like that unless we knew what it was.
See, that's exactly the same conclusion I came to when I started reading all these accounts. They had to be following this. There was another event that was happening earlier that day, which was the Cosmos 96 coming in, but it landed in Canada at 3 a.m. So they all, at first everyone thought it was the Cosmos 96 that landed at Kecksburg. But the object at Kecksburg had no windows, it had no doors, it had no jets. There were no ladders or landing gear or anything on this acorn type object that landed at Kecksburg. So it was finally in 2003 when NASA finally totally ruled out that it was the Cosmos satellite coming in. But the reason I think I have a rough time with it coming from Earth. Now, I'm not saying 100%, that it came from another planet or which planet, but knowing that in the 1970s with the Voyager putting those symbols on the Voyager's body, stating that it was, where it came from and what it was, it doesn't make sense for us to put symbols on a space probe and then just send it to Kecksburg. It would be more likely if it was coming from another area. No country claimed that it was theirs.
Along those lines, the Germans also had symbols on theirs.
Yes.
They weren't about to tell people how to use this thing if it was found somewhere else. They wouldn't be putting instructions on the outside, especially in symbology that wasn't even understood at the time.
Well, there is one theory that the Nazis who were experimenting with the bell, that some of the writing was referred to as rune symbols, which they used at that time. And since the Nazis were, dabbling in the occult, they could have been rune symbols. I don't know for sure, but they were some kind of symbols. And just knowing that in some cases when you're sending a space probe way out, and knowing it's going to end at some time, land sometime, you probably want to let people know where it's coming from and that it's not a, some kind of traveling device. Yes, sir.
Was that bell ever actually used, or is that always a prototype, the original one? Was it ever actually Common's bell? Was it ever actually? Do we know that it was actually ever constructed and used, or was it always a prototype?
It's a good question. He was asking if the Commoner's bell was ever constructed and used. And according to the research that I've done, and of course I wasn't there, I wasn't born yet, but it was. And then there were several deaths associated with the Commoner's bell use. And it had it used a type of a mercury-based liquid, a purple-colored mercury-based liquid apparently, that rotated, that gave it the anti-gravitational properties. And they were into something. And one theory is that Commodore disappeared along with the bell. And around 1945, they think they could have brought him to the United States to work on similar projects. Others claim he was committed suicide or he was killed by the Germans at that time. It's relatively feasible, at least in my mind. If they wanted to get rid of this bell, which was top secret, they could have sent it in orbit. But for 20 years, and then recalled it, again, that's just something to throw out there. But there were people, and they tested it with plants get back to your question, and the people on the plants and scientists who were working on it at first, apparently a lot of them died and it turned to this black goo. So, I wouldn't want to be the first one riding that one.
So it kind of raises a theory then that maybe either that could have been some wacko in Canada trying to recreate the bell, or maybe something similar landed in Germany in the 30s, which gave Commodore the idea of trying to recreate it.
That's another theory. There's just some, I find, bizarre theories on how the technology for Commodore's bell came into being. And one of them was from an alien source. I didn't say that. But there were some things going on. They claimed, again, this is one report. It wasn't well, I guess it was a report of an eyewitness that claims that there was a concave mirror on the Commodore's bell, and actually you could see backwards in time. Now, I've got side view mirrors on my car. I'm waiting to get one of those installed. But I don't know. It's pretty. But it could be. When you think about it, they could have, if they wanted to hide it, they could have put it into orbit.
Or maybe it really did travel through time.
Oh.
20 years later, it landed.
And what's odd is I've been doing research lately on the concept of string theory and quantum physics, and you start looking at multi-dimensions, which brings in a whole new set of possibilities that weren't there 10 years ago. Question? Yes?
Just a quick one. When you present like your track as it comes across Canada and so on and so forth.
Okay.
Now there's other investigations, whether it's a 9/11 investigation, whatever, that are very meticulous with eyewitnesses, whatever, and precise, in this case, GPS positioning, whatever, of where the events happen over what period in space. Is there anything similar done in that I had never been finding on Kecksburg online as to the trajectory, the altitude, the movements, and overall on all these presentations, you don't find it in the mass media. They all get laughed at. But when it's presented in a scientific forum, wouldn't the mass media be more apt to put it out there?
Yes, to answer this gentleman's question, he's asking about, is there more detailed, specific data points from the reentry path of the Kecksburg incident? So yes, there are, and they are available. And that was used in, I think it was 2003, in conjunction with testimony from NASA experts. That's how they came to the conclusion then that it was not the Cosmos satellite. There are a set, I don't have access to those. I have seen them, but there is a set of data points that show exactly the path that it was coming in and the projected path. And there, I think they're somewhere, I can't recall exactly where, that they are available, but they're out there. They're detailed. That's what was rejected by the NASA scientists. Okay, I think.
Do you know or have knowledge of any proof that this could have been a manned space object?
Okay. The question is, could this have been a manned space object, and do I have any proof of it? I've only read one account, and it wasn't ever corroborated with another account, where a general or a high-ranking official from the Army jumped on top of that device that they smacked it with something that looked like a baseball bat, and a door opened and something came out. I never saw that stated again. And marijuana wasn't legal in Pennsylvania at that time, so I don't know. One last question, young lady.
Yes, you, at the beginning, you said that you had an encounter. Could you share it?
Very briefly, because we're running out of time here, but that's another story for another time, but very briefly, in Pennsylvania, I was not investigating this, but I was driving with another witness, and I had a sports car that had a moonroof, And this object was more or less waiting for me. It rose, it came up, it started glowing green, and it basically looked like a manta ray, and it flew over the top of my car, and everyone inside, I mean, the whole inside turned that same color green, and then it took off. And there were other witnesses that saw it earlier.
Were you scared?
No, I did start hyperventilating afterwards because my mind could not wrap around what just happened, but it happened too quickly to be scared. When I think about it now, I get scared. No. All right. Thank you very much.